Hello, everybody. Welcome to a chat with Lucy Lewis, obviously myself, and my dear friend Paul Nolan here. So today we're going to be having a chat about The Window, which is a piece sourced, all the information sourced by Paul himself, written by Paul himself, directed by Paul himself. So I have always had a real interest. I was working with Paul when he started to do the research, when he was writing it. I've seen the production on stage with Connor, who's Paul's son, playing the role of James, which we'll obviously talk about later. And I've just always found it so interesting. And I would love to know everything there is to know about the whole process that you went through, because I know, not really firsthand, obviously, because I didn't do any of the research myself, but it looked like there was a lot that went into it. And I know that you spent so much time and effort getting everything that you needed. So I'd love today to talk about that process of getting from start to finish. So what I want to ask you first, I think, is just what prompted you to want to research this and write this down and make it into a story that it was?
Okay, so many years ago, my distant cousin, whose name is Claire, she contacted me because she wanted some details about my grandparents, where they were from, because she was writing the family tree for the family. And to be honest, I didn't really know that much about my family tree. And so I started looking at the family tree that she'd put together, and it was almost like on rolls of wallpaper. It had all been sellotaped together, but there was this whole section that she didn't know about. So I started asking my gran questions, and I asked my grandfather questions, and they gave me some answers. So I was able to feed that back to Claire. In doing that process, though, I was when I went to see my gran, I actually had a Coventry City football shirt on, and the name on the back of the shirt was O'Neill, because it belonged to Michael O'Neill, who was a football player at the time. And my gran says, "Oh, that's weird that you've got a football shirt with O'Neill on the back of it, because they're in the family." I went, "What?" She says, "Yeah." She says, "Claire, who has contacted you, that's her line. That's her family line, the O'Neill family line." And so I contacted Claire and I said, "Can you tell me more about this?" And she said yes, which she then did. And then for my birthday present, my wife bought me a subscription to the Ancestry, so you could do your own bits of research. So from what I gathered, I then started looking into that. And so I started looking at the O'Neill element of it, and I realized that let me get this right. So where it's my great grandmother and my great grandfather lived, they lived in the same street where I used to have an office when I was in a theatre company. Nice. And I thought, that is a bit spooky. And that was on Silver Street. So it's when there used to be houses run by Lady Herbert's garden, and that's where they used to live. And I thought, that is really weird. So I started looking into that. And then I found out that my great grandmother, her name was Mary Ivy O'Neill before she got married. And she married a fella called William Nottingham. Okay. And when they got married, they moved to the Earlston area of Coventry. But what I didn't know was the history of her brothers. And so when I started researching that, I realized that she had 4 brothers. Well, no, she had 5 brothers and 2 sisters, 5 brothers and 2 sisters. Sadly, the 2 sisters, the twins, they died in infancy. And one of her brothers, who was called James, he died when he was very young as well. But her oldest brother, Joe, we don't know who Joe's father is.
Oh my goodness.
And then there's William, and William went off and fought in the Boer War and was part of the Royal Warwickshire Regiment. And then when the First World War came around, that's when the James that I talk about in the play, that's when he tried to sign up, but he couldn't. And then he had to go elsewhere to sign up. And that then basically tells his story. And then when kind of the conscription element came in, that's when his older brother, Albert, he was forced to sign up. And he basically was signed up. They shipped him to France. And then he was involved in the first days of the Battle of the Somme. But that's a different story. But yeah, that one's, I couldn't make a whole play out of that because his time in the army was so short. But yeah, but that's kind of how it came about, really. It was just from the family research and doing the family tree. And the more I kept revisiting the O'Neill side, the more I wanted to find out about Albert, James and William. But I just kept always being drawn to James. So when I spoke to Claire about James, she said, well, you know where his gravestone is? I went, I do not. And she'd actually been over to France and taken a photo of his gravestone and sent it back. And I went, I definitely need to know more about this now. So that's kind of where it all kind of first originated, where it started to come from.
Wow. So you didn't know anything about James or any of that side of the family before you started out?
No. One of the first things I did on Ancestry was to try and go through the army records. But what I soon discovered is that you think that you've got the right piece of information. And so then you start on that route. And then as things start adding to it, you then realize that you're way off track. You're actually following somebody else. And you think, hold on, this isn't right. So this is why the research took so long, because everything that I found out, I wanted to cross-reference with another source to ensure that it was true and it was accurate. Because the more I started researching the story, the more I started developing the story in my head. And I didn't think about doing it as a play to begin with. It was just a fascinating story. And then it was my wife that said, I wonder if you could do it as a play. I went, oh, I don't know. I haven't really thought about it, because at the moment there's about 20, 30 people involved. So I have no idea how I'd fund something like that. And I've never actually staged something on my own, so I've never kind of produced anything on my own before. I've always worked in partnership or with other companies. So yeah, so the more I started finding out, the more interesting it was. And when I actually got the first part of the play, it's not the beginning, it's the section where he signs up. He can't sign up in Coventry, because when he goes to Coventry, they're given tickets, because on the bank holiday of on the August bank holiday, when it was announced in 1914, lots of young men wanted to get out of their jobs, and of course they went to the recruiting offices, and the queues were so vast, they were told to come back in a week to 2 weeks time to sign up, because they just couldn't handle the numbers of people. So James wasn't, I would say he was very tenacious. So he basically took the tram and some of the transport and went to Nuneaton and signed up in Nuneaton. And from Nuneaton, he was then enlisted into the Durham Light Infantry. And he didn't want to be in the Durham Light Infantry. He wanted to be in the Royal Warwickshire Regiment, because that's where his older brother was. And they said, well, no, you're going to Durham. And off he went. And that was pretty much it. So from that bit to him signing up to when he leaves England to go to France, that was the little bit of the play that I'd done the first bit of the research on. And my son Connor at the time, he was at Arts University Bournemouth in his final year of Arts University Bournemouth. And one of the things that he had to do on his course was that he had to perform a 20-minute piece from an unpublished piece of work. And so he said, you know that story that you've written, what do you think about doing it? And I went, do you know what, I probably could do that and tell, so he tells his story from his point of view. And so he worked through it with his tutors, and he staged it in the theatre there, and it was packed. He invited Anne and I down to go and see it, and the theatre itself, there was people standing at the back, and then they had to do a live stream to the Students' Union building, where they then projected it onto a wall so the people in Students' Union could watch it as well, because it was just crazy. I'd never seen anything like it. And he said to me, he says, I'm going to need the costume. I went, okay. So I did some research into the costume, and I realized that the khaki serge that was used in the First World War, it came from India. So I approached a small tailors in India, sent them all the, what do you call those things? Measurements. And yeah, and 2 weeks later, this World War One full army uniform arrived in the post. It was just incredible. So I sent it down to Bournemouth. We turned up a couple of hours before the show. Conrad had all his hair cut into the style of James's haircut that he had before he went to France. And he just stood there totally kitted out. And Anne and I almost cried, because it was that stark realization then that you realize that these were just boys, young men that were, you know, stepping into something that they had no idea what they were stepping into. And I think it was that moment, and I thought, I've got to tell the full story here, because if I don't, I'm not doing James a justice, and I'm not doing the audience a justice either, or the family, because I need to do more. So just from that short 15-20 minute piece that I wrote, I then did that as a reading at the Albany Theatre.
That's what I was going to ask. I think I came to see you do that. I was going to ask if it was the same episode.
Yes, that was it. And then I decided to add a few slides to give it a bit of context as well, you know, slides and images from the time. And then from there, I was approached by the Belgrade Theatre. So the Belgrade Theatre contacted me, and the artistic director there, Hamish Glenn, he arranged a meeting, and he said that he'd heard about this piece that I'd done. Did I have any intentions to take it any further? And I said, yeah, I'd like to research it more and actually do it as a full-length piece. And he said, if you can write it with no more than 2 actors, if it can be a 1-act play, no more than an hour and 15 minutes, it's got to have context to Coventry, and it needs to obviously be set during the time of the First World War. If you can do that, I'll commission you to write it. And that's what I did. So the actual writing process and the funding to help with the writing and the research actually came from Hamish at the Belgrade.
Amazing.
And it was 2 years. 2 years in total it took me just to research it. Yeah.
That was similar to what my next question was going to be. So were you, in terms of writing and research, were you researching as you went along? Were you finding that you thought you'd finished and you had to add extra bits in, or something was wrong and you had to, or did you gather up as much as you could before you started to create?
It's odd because the kind of the war bit, I thought I had all the information for it. And then I realized that in Durham, there are records offices in Durham where they hold all the archives there for the Durham Light Infantry. So then I made an appointment to go to Durham, to go to the cathedral, to go to the records office, to go to the council buildings, and to meet some of the people up there, and went to the Durham Light Infantry Museum as well. So all the soldiers that were lost in the First World War, they were all commemorated, and all of their medals were on display. It was mind-blowing. I also went to the Imperial War Museum to do some research there. I then had to contact the War Office because I discovered that they actually had James's regiment's diary from when it was formed to when it was disbanded. Goodness. And the whole thing is handwritten in pencil. So then I had to decipher everything. and when the infantry went, so he was part of the 15th Durham Light Infantry, and the way it works is that infantry is then split into 4 companies. So you've got A, B, C, and D company, or COI, as it was named for short. And so James was part of those. But you realise that every time there was an offensive, or they were involved in shelling or fighting or anything else, the person that entered the entries in the diary was called the adjutant, or like an administrator. And then you realize then that the handwriting changes, and then it's reported in somebody else's hand that, I don't know, Fitzgerald went missing, and we haven't heard from him again. And then you have this new person, we'll call him Smith, and he writes for a couple of days, and then the handwriting changes again. Something like Colonel Smith received fatal wounds on the 7th instant on such and such, and it just keeps going on like this. So it took me ages to decipher it all, and then I typed it all up, and then I cross-referenced that with the information that the officers were holding from the records office that was in Durham. So when you compare the two, that's what gives you the accurate element of it. And then I was able to then put some of those findings into Ancestry, and then I use that then as the research to actually build the story. So in terms of the story itself, I would say 90% of it is factual.
Okay.
It's all based on fact, which has all been cross-referenced. And I've got this huge archive box upstairs that's got all my stuff in it. Because I've got maps of Coventry, I've got the trench maps that they were using, copies of the trench maps that they were using at the time, of photographs, publications. There's just so much stuff. But it was whittling it all down. That was the challenge, really.
The process itself must have been quite intense and quite obviously in depth, and I'd say it's one thing to get all of this information, but then, like you say, to try and decipher what's factual, what's not, and who's writing what. It must have been a lot.
Yeah.
So I think that's fair for you. I'd like to discuss the process of the transition from paper to stage. So were there any, well, just in general, but were there anything that was specifically difficult, or did you have anything, maybe, I don't know, you had a particular idea for something in your head and then it translated differently to stage, or just in general, talk us through that process?
Yeah. When I wrote this, I'm trying to think of the best way to describe. When I write something, I try to write it so you can visualize it. Yeah. So I try and write in pictures, if that makes sense, so that when you read it, so when you're reading it, you can visualize where you are, what you're doing, and what's happening around you. So I try and build an environment, and that was a challenge, because what I definitely didn't want was a staging set, if you like. I didn't want that. I just wanted an empty space, and I wanted to have a screen that could be projected on at one end of the stage, and I only wanted to use 2 props. So I wanted to keep the staging to an absolute minimum. So the things that I used were a trunk, an old like traveling trunk from the 1920s, and a pocket watch. That was it. That's all I used. In terms of the staging of it, there's one of the scenes towards the end of the play that I wrote that talks about James having these kind of manifestations, because one of the things that comes up in lots of the diaries, and when you read lots of the World War I stories, which focuses on the individuals, because they were exhausted, because they weren't eating, because they were constantly on the move, they would have like these manifestations or these kind of out-of-body experiences, and they're absolutely believable. You know, it's like being half asleep, half awake, and you think that something's happening around you, and it's absolutely real. Okay, so I took some of these ideas and I wrote one section where James believes that he's finished his time in the army. He comes back to Coventry, but everything's changed. So it's like he's gone into a different place in time, and he doesn't recognize anything. And then when he comes away from Coventry, he basically walks around the corner and what faces him is this huge open field, and all the stone tablets that are lined up, which is your archetypal wall grave. So I then thought to myself, how about if I staged it traverse style? Meaning, so for those that aren't familiar with traverse, if you imagine the stage is on a railway track and the audience are on the platforms either side, so everybody is facing in. So what I did was I set it up so you could have 40 seats on each side of this railway track, if you like, with a gap in the middle. So you've basically got 4 rows of 20 people on it. And when you line, and when I set that up in the theatre space, and how I visualized it is that actually represented a wall grave. Okay.
Oh, wow.
And so when people walked in, it was really funny actually, because when I did it the first time at the Albany, the audience was actually expecting to be sitting in, you know, the normal rows with the stage at one end. But of course they walked in and there's just this projection screen with an image on it, and all the seats are a bit odd. And so of course they take up all the seats, and then as the play goes on, I actually use that style in a number of ways. So yes, it's a wall grave, which is kind of revealed at the end, but it's also a tunnel that he has to burrow under. Okay, so I use it as a tunnel. I actually use it as a railway line, because one of the places where James and his brothers and sister used to play was actually on the railway lines in Earlsdon. You know, so when they're playing on the railway track and they hear the sound of the trains, you know, they rush up onto the banks, you know, so they join the audience, you know, from either side, shouting over to each other. And then when he arrives in France, I wanted to actually show, based on the diary entries, that it didn't matter how far forward they went on an offensive, they always had to come back, and they always ended up where they were. So it was about James making that physical journey, getting into a certain point, and then having to be pushed back again, going forward again, getting a little bit further and having to come back. So I kind of used that in terms of the staging for it. I also used it as well because it was a brilliant kind of runway for when he was doing all of his training and things like that, because it was a very physical piece for the actor playing James, incredibly physical, quite demanding, if I'm honest. But yeah, but both actors did a brilliant job of it. Yeah.
And obviously, you know, that allowed for the audience to be more immersed, I suppose, in the experience. Now, you mentioned there that it's a purposeful decision to keep the set minimal and have minimal props. Obviously, you said they just had 2 props. So what was the reasoning behind that? Was there like a specific, you know, you wanted to just draw more emphasis on the story? What was the reasoning behind that?
Yeah, a couple of reasons. I wanted to keep the staging of it as simple as possible, because I wanted to concentrate on the acting, the physicality, the bareness of it, and the story. So, you know, when I was saying earlier that I try to write in pictures, even though there's nothing there, there's nothing really to see, you can visualize everything that's going on purely from the physical storytelling and the lighting that I used and the soundscape that I used and the images that I used, which marked, you know, the place and time. It also made touring a lot easier rather than having a massive set. I mean, yes, I was touring my own lighting rig, my own sound rig, the props and, you know, the few props and the costumes, but that was it really. That's kind of all I needed to actually tell this story.
Yeah, and I suppose, I mean, obviously I've seen it myself, and I can, from an audience member's perspective, I can safely say that I think an elaborate, you know, set or multiple props would have probably hindered that desire that you were after in terms of just creating, you know, you didn't need anything else other than the 2 actors there, and like you say, all the other lighting and sound. So it's quite clever. And I wanted to, you know, ask you how it felt you know, seeing this concept, you know, or just this question that your relative Claire had asked you go from a question to a full touring production? How did that feel?
When I came to do the first performance, I was sitting behind the kind of technical desk. So I had somebody who was operating lights, somebody who was operating sound, and then I was operating all the slides. And so I was having to call when all the cues were. And then when I saw all these people sitting in the seats, I had a really cold feeling. I thought, what if this just isn't going to work? Oh, what am I going to do? And I've got nowhere to go. I've got nowhere to hide. What if it's a complete and utter disaster? Maybe, oh, what have I done? What have I done?
Oh, no.
And then, but of course, by that point, the first piece of music that I used is The Lark Ascending. And once that was playing, I just thought, well, I'm just going to have to go for it now. And yeah, seeing it performed for the first time. And when it got to the end of the play, and the last few words were spoken and the final fade to blackout came, and then the lights came up and the two actors came out, it was an incredible sight, because ordinarily in a theatre people would start clapping. They didn't. I think it had just stunned them, because there were people visibly crying, you know, and weeping. And then a few people started to clap, and then other people clapped. And people were just crying. And that's what really got me, you know. I thought, wow, I wasn't really expecting that reaction, but it's obviously, you know, it's had that effect. And there's a really good friend of mine who is an archivist, and he came to see the play. And he was really, really interested, because he was actually following the process that I was taking, because a lot of the information I needed about Coventry, he knew, you know, because he'd done similar work about Coventry himself. And one of his best friends is also a local history writer as well. So I could actually go to him for a bit of advice. And he came to see me afterwards, and he stood in front of me, and I looked at him, and he couldn't form words. He was, yeah, and he was just so upset. I said, look, it doesn't, I said, these are only words. And he's almost like he went to slap me. He said, they're not just words. They're not just words. He said, you've created something here. And this kind of goes on a par with other plays that have been performed in Coventry, because it has direct relevance to people that lived and worked and trod the same streets that we tread today. And he said, if you hadn't done this, nobody would know this story. And it's not necessarily about James, his brothers and his parents. It tells a wider story. It tells a human story of, you know, hope, survival, loss, and also joy as well, and excitement. I think I say in some of the publicity, you know, it'll send him on the most extraordinary adventure that he could ever go on, and that's exactly what it did.
But I think also, you know, you're saying there it's not the O'Neill story. In a way, something I was thinking of the other day, it's almost everyone's story, because we've all, you know, got relatives that will have a similar story who fought in the war. And you know, that I've got relatives now that I'm thinking I don't even know their names, I don't know their stories, and there's probably so much I could uncover, you know. So I think, you know, that's probably another reason that it touches so many people. And also just from a production perspective, I mean, I saw it, well, I know Rory played James the first time, but I saw it when Connor played James, and obviously Connor's been my friend for years, and I was heartbroken seeing Connor fighting in the war and dying. Like, it was just, I think it really, like I said before, the immersion that the three of you managed to create in that sense was phenomenal. And I remember Connor standing in front of me at the end, you know, for the bow, and we both just laughed. And for me, it was like I don't know, it was almost just joyful that my friend Connor they'd managed to pull me into, I think it's incredible that, you know, he'd managed to pull me into this whole other world that I'd forgotten who he was. So yeah, just everything you were saying there about audience members crying things, I was like, yes, I completely. So I imagine for you then, obviously going from, oh gosh, I've had some sort of major mistake here. I mean, then seeing the audience then react and knowing that you'd, you know, you created something special, you must have known then that you'd really come on to something.
Yeah, I think when we did the first run at the Albany with Rory, and it then went on tour, went on a national tour. The organisation that I did the national tour with is called Live and Local, and and their philosophy is to take professional productions and put them into venues where the people in those localities wouldn't normally go and see theatre, dance, music, film, that type of thing. And so this format in terms of the Traverse style worked really well because it was going into village halls, it was going into community centres, and the first tour just sold out. So Live and Local, the promoter at Live and Local, a chap called John Laidlaw, he came back to me and he said, we need to book another tour. He said, there's just an overwhelming response for this, you know, more people want it. And in fact, some of the venues that booked it the first time wanted to book it again. And I said, well, I can't do that, you know, we've got to give other people the opportunity. And so we booked another tour, another national tour. And then the Lord Mayor at the time, when I did the first tour, his name was Tony Skipper, Councillor Tony Skipper. He came to see me afterwards and he said, we need to put this play on in the cathedral. I said, oh, cathedral's big venue. He says, no, it needs to be on in the cathedral. And we have the International Peace Festival in November. So can we book it in? I said, well, okay. But what then transpired is that the Lark Ascending, the piece of music I use at the beginning and at the end of the play, that whole piece was actually going to be performed at the cathedral on the night that I was due to do the play. So they actually transferred it to St. Mary's Guildhall instead. And so there was it was a close performance by guests of the Lord Mayor, and the Lord Mayor at that time was Councillor John Blundell, and he came to see it, and his wife, and lots of people came. People from City of Culture came to see it. It was just absolutely packed. And the strange thing is that the Lord Mayor's assistant, the lovely Jane, she turned to Connor and she said, you know who played here, don't you, in St. Mary's Guildhall? And Connor said, no. He said, this is one of the first venues where a young William Shakespeare performed.
Oh my goodness, I didn't know that.
And isn't it weird that today is Shakespeare's birthday? So this is where William Shakespeare performed as an actor at St. Mary's Guildhall in Coventry.
Amazing.
Isn't that bonkers? And so Connor was taken back by this comment and uttered a very quiet expletive and then said, well, no pressure then. But yeah, it was, that was a bit special, St. Mary's Guildhall. That was definitely a good one. And then from there, it then went on tour again. And again, it pretty much sold out everywhere it went. And then it was actually due to be staged at the old grammar school on Hale Street in Coventry in November last year. But sadly, with everything to do with the pandemic, we were unable to do it. So we're hoping that we might be able to do it later this year. We'll see how it goes. We'll see how things pan out. But that's the plan.
Okay, that would be great. It definitely deserves to have another round. So as I've mentioned before, I think James's story is incredible. And I think we've all got a James. said, in our family, multiple Jameses that we don't know about. I can imagine, you know, after going through the research process and seeing it on stage, also then, you know, you mentioned before about how you and Anne went to see Connor perform that little section at uni, and it was quite overwhelming. So I can imagine that, you know, in a fully staged play was equally a lot to deal with. You know, you obviously watched the play happen night after night, but would you say that you still shared, you know, for the audiences, it's the first time we're seeing it, so but would you say that you still shared that sentiment with the audience and that emotional response?
Yes, yes, most definitely. One of the reasons being is that both Rory and Connor, they brought their interpretation of James's character to the stage. And Corinne, who played Ivy, who played my great-grandmother, her interaction with both of those actors was just beautiful. You would honestly believe that they were brother and sister. They had such a bond, you know, both of them, and it was completely believable. And Corinne would, I'd go and see the actors straight after the show, just to see if they were okay. And Corinne, every time, she said, "I just need a minute." Oh. Whereas Rory was saying, "That's another one done." You know, but yeah, the journeys that all three actors took came through, and there were little nuances and little things that they tried and things that worked and little things that they changed, and sometimes little things would go wrong, but it didn't matter because I completely trusted them. You know, there was one particular night and I thought to myself, hold on a minute, you've just jumped a scene. you've completely missed a whole scene out. And I realized, because obviously the slides coincide with the action that's happening. And so I had to whiz to the part of the play where they had jumped to, and then realized that the scene that they'd actually missed was the whole transition from when James is in his civilian tattered clothing into a World War I army uniform. So he ended up going to the front line in his tattered old civvies, which was hilarious. And he said to me afterwards, he said, I think I missed a bit. I said, yeah, you did. But do you know, it didn't matter. It really didn't matter, because they carried it and nobody even questioned it. I mean, when we did the first tour, I'd offer a Q&A session afterwards. So if the audience wanted to talk about anything, or, you know, they had any questions, you know, we were there. And on that particular night, nobody mentioned anything about why was he serving in France in civilian clothing? But it didn't matter, because I think they were just taken by the whole story and they engaged with the characters that they were playing, that they were just swept along, you know.
Amazing. Goodness me. Now, you have mentioned briefly earlier, when, you know, the more research you did and the more you found out, the more you realized that you wanted to do the story justice and to do these people justice. So, you know, I can imagine that was heightened, obviously, because they are your relatives. But would you also, you know, the same could be said for Connor, but more so because, you know, he was written by his dad.
Yeah. That was the thing is that I really wanted Connor to, I wrote it with Connor in mind.
Yeah.
That was the thing. But then Connor went and got himself a job. As a jobbing actor, he got himself a job which took him to London for a few months, and then the show that he was in was then transferred to Manchester, so he was there for a few months. Then Manchester, he came to Birmingham, and he just couldn't break that contract. So the first thing, so when I knew that he'd signed an agreement elsewhere. That didn't bother me in the slightest, because I was just pleased that he was finding work. But I sat down and had a conversation with him, and I said, from what you know about the play, who would you approach? Who would be on your wish list? And he said, there's only one person, and that's Rory Nolan. And I went, absolutely. And so I contacted Rory. Rory came around the house, and Corinne, Rory, and we did a read through of the whole thing, and he just got it. He got it within the first couple of pages. He was just there. But the weird thing is that the publicity photo that you see over there, so I had this taken in the Memorial Park in Coventry before we knew that Connor couldn't do it first time around. And Rory said, doesn't look like me. I said, no, but think of it, it's what represents a Tommy universally. and that's kind of how we approach that. But yeah, I mean, he did incredibly well. But the haunting thing is that Connor was playing his, let me get this right now, so it's his great uncle. And the first time Connor played him, he was exactly the same age that James was.
Goodness me. That
is, and the publicity photos that I had taken with Connor in them for the second tour, I've actually got an image of James in the background on a projection, and then Connor standing, and you can see the likeness, and that's haunting. But I think it's a testimony to the family as well.
It's such a lovely thing as well that you could keep it in the family in that sense, and I think it must be such a nice thing as well for Connor to have given great sorrow that honor. So that's amazing. Now I want to know what your approach is as a director. So I have asked you previously, if you had any specific ideas in your head about what you wanted. Are you more of do you have like a clear-cut image of what you want to see the actors do in a particular moment, or did you allow for like a little bit more play and more approach?
The working with Rory and working with Connor was quite different. What was achieved, however, was really good on both sides. The approach just had to be different, that's all. So Rory, for example, he kind of knew instinctively what to do, but what he didn't have experience of was actually was doing a lot of stage work in the setup in terms of traverse. So in terms of the blocking, if he spent too much time with his back to one side of the audience, I had to balance that by having the actor on the other side, so you could always see kind of what was going on. So that took a little bit of work, so that he was familiar with that in terms of that bit of it. It was also, I mentioned earlier, it was incredibly physical. I had him running, I had him marching, I had him running and talking and shouting and screaming and singing, all of this. And I think the first week, he said to me, I didn't realize it was going to be such hard work. He says, and I've got so many words. I said, don't worry about the words. The words will come. So the more you play the story, and the story is linear, apart from the flashbacks and the manifestations, it will become really clear. And he got it. And I'd say by the beginning of the second week, if I said to him, we actually need to stage this tomorrow, he would have said, okay, let's do it. But it wasn't until the third week, obviously, that we did it and we refined it. Connor's approach was different in that the two of us worked solidly together for a week, and we took each scene in turn. And I said, how have you got on with learning it? And he said, I haven't learned it. I said, what do you mean you haven't learned it? He says, no. He says, oh, he says that's what rehearsals are for. I said, what? So he looked at the first scene, and then we had, like flip chart paper.
Yep.
He had this enormous flip chart, and then he just started making all the notes for scene 1, and we stuck it up on the wall. And he said, right, okay, let's do this one then. And so he kind of staggered through the first scene, and he said, so this is where I think I should be standing. Is that okay? I said, yeah, that's absolutely fine. And that's how we worked. So in that first week, we managed to block the whole play on his instinct and how he felt it would work. And then by the beginning of the second week, he'd nailed all the words, and we were able to run it. And then I could bring Corinne in. And then Corinne then basically worked with Connor and myself, because obviously some of the things had changed in terms of interpretation. And then, yeah, so by the end of the second week, it was ready to go. It was, but I gave him a lot of play with it as well.
Yeah.
Because I'd written it for him, and because I knew how he worked, and I kind of played to his strengths really. And that's kind of what he delivered on.
Amazing. It must have been very nice to, obviously you know how he works as an actor anyway, but working in that dynamic must be nice as a director. But you have mentioned there's a lot of dialogue, and it is a two-hander. Both actors had quite a lot to say, so it's a heavy piece in terms of content, but also in tone.
Yeah.
So would you say that the actors had any struggle in that sense of the story justice whilst carrying all of that?
Yeah, there was. I think all 3 actors had a bit of a concern about the authenticity, and wanted to do it justice and wanted to stay true to the story. And I said, well, as long as you don't deviate and start freestyling in the trenches, I think you'll be okay. And but in terms of what they knew about the piece, they bought into it straight away. And I mean, they really put the work in. I mean, they really put the work in. They worked so hard, because there was nowhere to hide.
Yeah, of course.
There was nowhere to hide, and they were on view for the whole hour and 15 minutes. There was nowhere to go. There was nowhere to. You couldn't even go into the corner, because it wasn't that we didn't have corners. So yeah.
Okay, start to finish, the whole journey.
Yeah.
What was one of, if not the most challenging aspect of the whole thing?
The very last scene.
Okay.
The last scene was the hardest to do, and it was the one that I found most challenging to write. So from the war diary and from some of the information that I gathered, I managed to find out that James and the rest of his company had gone back to billets for 2 weeks. So they'd served, I think it was 6 weeks on the front line. And then they zigzagged back through the trenches, they got a train, and they went back to billets where they were safe. They were miles away from the front line, so they were completely safe. And it was when they were in billets that they were kind of defumigated of lice. They were given new uniforms, they had new boots. They were fed, they were watered, they slept, and then they were back within 2 weeks. And one of the things that is apparent within the diaries is everybody associates the front line with all the shelling and the gunfire and the rapid fire and the shouts and the screams and the muddy ditches and no man's land and the potholes and all of that. But nobody really focuses on the boredom, because there were days that went by where there was nothing happening, and you couldn't put your head above the trench. because a sniper would get you.
Yeah.
And I think so when James returned, they were all really bored. And the enemy was 50 yards away. So if you think 50 yards is nothing.
No.
So if one person popped their head up and somebody on the other side popped their head up, you would see the color of their hair. Do you know what I mean? And it was that close proximity that I thought, good grief, this is amazing. But like I said, they were really bored. And so one of the commanding officers said, we need a couple of volunteers. So James's hand went up, and another fella, he stuck his hand up. His name was Robert Niles. And they said, what are we doing then? And they said, right, this is what we'd like you to do. Because there's been no activity for the last few days, we need you to go and find out what's happening. What's happening from the enemy side. Yeah. And I said, and he said, well, how? He says, well, what we've done is we've dug a trench under no man's land, which comes up on the other side, which is going to be very close to where the enemy are. So we just want you to try and get an idea, get a feel of what's kind of going on. But obviously you're going to need to be really quiet. And so they basically took him, both Robert and James went down these steps, and they went squelching through this tunnel very quietly, and they could hear scratching on the other side. And so on the other side, they had a ladder. And so the idea was that they would very slowly creep up the ladder. And on this particular night, there was a full moon. And so as he crept up the ladder, he's listening to see what's going on. And then it finishes. Okay, that's it, done. And then Robert goes to see what's going on and it finishes for him as well.
Oh my goodness.
And that was the hardest thing to write, because the officers back in James's infantry obviously hear the gunshots. They send people down the trench, they get James and Robert, and they take them to a field ambulance. But by that point it's too late. Because of the injuries he sustained. But that was really hard to write, really hard. And that was the scene that I put off to the last moment, which is called the listening post. That was the tough one.
I think especially like you said before, Connor at the time was the same age.
Yeah.
So I think, seeing your son, or I suppose anyone that age, really brings that reality into play. It's astonishing to think that men this young were put in these situations. It's really heartbreaking.
Yeah.
Awful.
What was, in terms of the research though, what was particularly poignant, because like I said, I went to lots of different record offices. There was record offices in Warwick, because I was finding about James's father, who was also James O'Neill, who was put into an asylum at Hatton over in Warwick. And I managed to find his records from when he was admitted to the asylum, and a photograph of him, the only surviving photograph of him, which is in this admissions book, huge, great ledger, which again is all handwritten. And then I realized that his mother was in the same asylum as well. So, but that's a different story. But when I went to Coventry, I was going through what was called the Herald, which was one of the local newspapers at the time. So I knew when the date of James's fate. And so I was just scouring newspapers to see if there was any entries. And then I found one, and it was only a few days after, with a photo of James and an obituary that was written by my great grandmother, who was James's sister. But it was actually signed by her mother, but her mother couldn't read or write.
Oh goodness.
So I found that, and I found the picture of James. Again, it's the only surviving photo of him. So yeah, that was quite hard to read as well, and in such a short space of time as well. It's literally within a few days that's in the newspaper. It's like, that you'd be impressed if that happened today. But this was over 100 years ago. So that was quite poignant. Yeah,
it's
seeing
pretty
his
hard,
face.
isn't it? Right, Paul, I need you to pause for literally 2 seconds. I've just realized that my phone has not been charging this whole time and I've got 2%, so I want to get a different charger because I'm not finished. Wait there.
One.
Okay, Paul, so we've already briefly mentioned it, the use of the projection images. Talk us through that choice and why you wanted to add those in.
Yes, one of the reasons for it, because there was no set, I wanted to place certain images that reflected what was going on at certain times. But again, that was almost like another research project, because I wanted all the images to be of the time, to be relevant, and to be as accurate as possible. And Claire, my cousin, she'd actually sent me a photograph of Eliza O'Neill. So this is James's mother, when she was sitting in the back garden of what today we know as the Weaver's house in Spon End, because that's where the O'Neills lived, at the old Weaver's house there. And I thought, I've got to get this picture in somehow. And so that's near the beginning of the play where we talk about that. But probably, I'm just trying to think now. Yeah, so I managed to find photos of the Durham Light Infantry, which was just incredible, and photos of the boat that they went over to France on, the actual boat with soldiers on it. And I was like, whoa, this is pretty cool. But what I could do is I could actually share with you one of the pictures that we've got. Hold on, I'm just gonna see if I can pop this up for you. Hold on a second. Oh. Hold on. Oh, technology.
Awful.
Brilliant when it works. Okay. Let me see if I can just share this with you. This is the very first image that you see when you come into the space and you take your seat. And then the lighting that's on the floor of the playing space and spills over onto the audience members is kind of reflected from this image. So let me see if I can just share this with you here.
There we go.
There we go. So can you see that okay?
I can.
So this is a stained glass window that's in All Souls Church in Earlston in Coventry. Okay. Yeah. And this is the window. Okay. So this is where the play takes its name from this. Now, after the First World War, the church itself was built to commemorate those who lost their lives in the Great War. And so they called on the local community to see if they could help fund the building of the church in some way. And so Mary Ivy O'Neill, my great grandmother, she commissioned this window to be put in.
Goodness.
And so this window actually, so if you were to go into All Souls Church, walk down the aisle, and then look to your left, this is the stained glass window that you see in the church. Okay. Wow. And there's an inscription in the bottom right hand corner. You can't see it on this one. And it just says, "Pray for the O'Neill family." And that's still there. So that's been there obviously for years. But what's also significant about the church is that that's the church where my own grandmother was housekeeper for that church. My grandfather was a warden at that church. My grandparents were married in that church. my mother, my uncle, and my aunt were all baptized in that church. My mother and father got married in that church. and my grandparents had their funerals in that church. So it's yeah, and it's a big church as well. So it's, if you don't know, it's just off Hersal Common.
No, I was just about to ask whereabouts it is.
Yeah, Hersal Common. Just it's not the church with the blue roof, it's the church with the green roof.
Green roof.
Catholic church over there. Yeah, so that gives you an idea.
Yeah, that was going to be so we can safely assume that's how the play got its name then.
Yeah. Okay, so are we back to normal now?
We are back to normal.
Fab. Okay, super. Let me just close.
Did you
go on ahead?
My other question, well, I suppose following on from that, I mean, that makes sense now as to why you chose The Window as the title, but at what stage did you know that? Did you have any other titles in mind maybe beforehand?
I wasn't really thinking of a title. In my mind, it was always James's story, but I couldn't call it James's story because it had no meaning. So it was when my aunt told me about The Window that Ivy had put in, that's when I thought, well, that makes total sense, because that actually that kind of completes the circle, really, about why, that was her commemoration, if you like, to the family. So that kind of made sense for me.
Yeah, I suppose there couldn't have really been another one. That just seems too perfect, I think.
Yeah.
So you mentioned earlier that you did have plans to put on the show again, which obviously because of COVID you couldn't do. And you did mention that hopefully this year, I mean, are you hoping to tour it again, or are you hoping to do like a stationary production? What are you thinking?
Yeah, I need to contact the people where it was originally provisionally booked to see if we could do it. I think taking it on tour might create a few problems, because I think audience numbers obviously are going to have to be drastically reduced.
Of course,
yeah. So I think I'll probably just do it again in Coventry. That's what I'd like to do anyway. And and if I did that again, that would fit in quite nicely with that story in terms of the local relevance. But I think it would also be good to have a local story during Coventry City of Culture as well, to because that gives it a bit of recognition as well. But I need to look at kind of funding opportunities and things like that, because one of the things that I'm quite adamant about is that I want the actors, to be recompensed for what they do. I don't want. I'm not somebody that kind of will do it on the cheap or ask somebody to do something as a favor. It's people's livelihoods at the end of the day, and the arts world is going through a stage of such fragility at the moment. I just want to ensure that if I do it, it's done properly and people are paid properly and accordingly that are involved, whether they are on the stage or whether they are supporting the production in some way.
Yeah, that's amazing. Well, I'll definitely come and see it again. So I truly hope it comes into fruition. Now, I know we've mentioned this costume of Connor's, but I've been staring at the poster behind you.
Yeah.
Because I just think, I know we mentioned before about the other image of James on a projection in the background with Connor in front, but that picture there behind you now is it's really profound, quite a haunting image. I'll
go this way so you can see it. Yeah.
So talk me through that whole thing there.
Okay, so when the costume arrived from India, my best friend Rob, who's a photographer, he said to me, he says, have you thought about an image for your play? And I said, I have. It needs to feature Connor. He needs to be in a World War I uniform. I need to think of a setting for it. And he said, well, you know that James and his brother Albert are remembered in a book of remembrance. And I said, yes. And I know there are 2 books of remembrance. One is in the War Memorial, which is in the Memorial Park in Coventry. And the other is in the Durham Light Infantry Chapel in Durham Cathedral. And when I went to Durham, sorry, this is a long-winded answer. And when I went to Durham, I went to the DLI chapel and I could see this book on display inside the chapel. And I think I was there in like September time when I was doing some research, and I was with Anne. And the chap came over and he says, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to ask you to leave now because this is run by volunteers and we need to just close for an hour for lunch. And I went, oh no. And he said, so where are you from? And I told him I was from Coventry. I was doing some research to the play, and told him about the DLI and James's involvement in it. And I said, so he'll be in this book. And he said, yeah, but we only show the page that corresponds with today's date. And as it was September, obviously they only show those who have fallen on that particular date in September. I went, okay, fair enough. So I'm one of the last people to leave the cathedral, and the chap says, oh, I think you might have left something in the chapel. I went, oh, have I? And so he closed the door of the cathedral. He said, yeah, come and follow me. So I followed him back to the chapel, and he took out a set of keys and he opened the glass cabinet and he turned to the 13th of November, and there was James's name written in black and gold and Robert Niles's name underneath, 13th of November 1915. I said, wow. I said, am I allowed to take a photo? He says, you can, but you need to be quick. So I took a couple of photos, and then he showed me out. But they were so lovely. So going back to this, how this came about was there is a book of remembrance at the Memorial Park. And in the Memorial Park, I don't know if you can see over Connor's right shoulder, but that's actually a tree trunk. And carved into the tree trunk are poppies. So it made total sense to have Connor either looking at that or standing in front of it or something around that. And so we tried lots of different permutations for it. Rob took about 300 photos on that shoot, and that was the one that we decided on. Now, I don't know if you noticed, but Connor's actually holding a Lee Enfield rifle there, which is the kind of rifle that was used on the front. But I didn't particularly want to see guns and stuff in the production, because that's not what it's about. It's about the human story. And so we managed to find a poppy, and we stuck a poppy in the end of it instead. so this is where it came from. And then a good friend of mine, a chap called Stuart, I gave him all these images and explained to him what I wanted, and he then put the artwork together for me. So he did a fantastic job as well.
It is amazing.
Now, what I've got set up, which might interest you, is that I've actually got a Facebook group which is called The Window, and I think there's about 400 people that are in there. And if you visit that Facebook group, you can get to see all of the production photographs, a few of the photographs that Rob took in terms of publicity. There's a whole host of other stuff on there as well. Audience comments, feedback, reviews. There's loads of rehearsal photographs are in there as well. And there's even a couple of movie clips that Rory did, to promote the show. So by all means, wander over to that and go and have a look.
I will. I'd love to. Well, I've had a scour through, and I know there's a couple of, I was going through the programme the other day from the show, and there's some nice images of all of you guys working on rehearsing and things, and some great pictures that Rory has done as well. They had different approaches to the role, so it'd be really nice to have a look at that contrast there.
Yeah.
Now, like we've said, this process rather been a lot, but I think the final question for you, Paul, is: do you have any other plans to unearth the lives of any other family members and bring them to life? where I said, did you have, oh, there you go.
Okay.
There's a bit of delay.
Now, the thing about records is, particularly war records, is that they don't become available until a certain time. So a period of time has to pass before they're allowed to go into the public domain. The only other thing, or the other story that I'd be really interested in writing is about my grandfather on my mother's side,
Okay.
who fought in this. Well, he didn't even fight. He was a nurse in the Second World War and spent a lot of time in Norway, but he wouldn't actually talk about any of his experiences to anybody. He didn't speak to his children, and he certainly didn't speak to me about it. So I'd like to find out a little bit more about that. The only other thing that I'd really like to find out about is on my father's side. So I'm from like Anglo-Irish heritage, and my father, before he died, was telling me the story about his mother, and his mother's family were on the side of Eamon de Valera, okay, and his father's side was on the side of Michael Collins, okay, and my grandfather fought alongside Michael Collins, okay.
Wow.
So there was a family divide, and yet the family was joined together. But the whole Michael Collins story absolutely fascinates me. He's one of my kind of heroes, really, the chief, of kind of what he stood for and how he tried to make Ireland completely independent, and how that was scuppered by, many other things that happened. But there's still talk today about unifying the country, but we shall see. But learning more about the kind of the Irish side, because my two uncles were both soldiers as well in the Irish Army, and they've told me a few things as well, which all seem to stack up. But finding Irish records is more difficult than finding the English records, because during the time of the Easter Rising, many of the buildings were destroyed by fire, so many of the records were lost. So I'm going to have a look at that. But yeah, either Window 2, focusing on my grandfather from World War II, or something on the Irish side would be really good. And I like that connection, because Coventry is twinned with Cork, which is where my family are from. And so it'd be brilliant to actually do a production where you use maybe some actors from Coventry and also some actors from Cork, and then you stage it. So you work, with a team of actors from two different cities, but you actually put the show on in the two different cities as well. And funnily enough, I was actually speaking to a friend of mine who's from Cork last night on a Zoom call, and we were talking about a few ideas. So that really interests me, that fascinates me, but that's for another time.
Well, I hope you do manage that one day. But thank you so much for talking about this today. Honestly, I'd say about 9 stuff I didn't know, and I thought I knew quite a lot. I worked with you, and I think, for me, I hope it encourages other people to maybe look at their own family history. There, that obviously, you've got relatives to talk about what happened in the war. Both my parents have said that their fathers who fought talk about it, and then you unearth all of the information and you learn why talk about it, and it's quite, I don't know, like I said before, it's that kind of thing. So I think fair play to you for doing all of this and bringing it to life. Phenomenal. You're welcome. About it.
Oh, yeah, maybe one day.
Well, thank you very much, Paul.
Okay, that's lovely. Thanks, Lucy.
Bye bye.
See ya.